Alright. We all know that not every weapon is created equally. Some dominate the class and define its roles, while others really need some TLC. And while for the most part weapons exist in a pretty good state of usability, more often than not, a weapon will fall from grace, never to be seen again. Looking at you, Bison. And I want to put a few of these weapons on the table, break down my beef with them, and maybe even throw out a few of my own ideas to solidify their roles. And to start it off, I want to focus in on the soldier's rocket repertoire, where the guns are, for the most part, incredibly well balanced. Each one has a defined role that it excels at, except for the Liberty Launcher and the Airstrike. Now, the Liberty Launcher is a weapon that I've talked about in depth before, and to summarize, the weapon spreads itself too thin. Its stats are all over the place, reducing rocket jump damage, extra rockets, rocket speed, and so on and so forth. I think that the Liberty Launcher could easily be changed to focus more on creating a shotgun roamer style of play by removing the projectile speed buff and focusing more on the blast damage reduction aspects of the weapon so that a shotgun could finally get some love. But I'm not going to keep beating a dead horse with the Liberty Launcher, so let's talk about the Airstrike. And this weapon is in a really weird spot for me, where I'm not sure if it's the weapon that's lackluster, or if I just don't realize how to use it. Obviously, if you look at the weapon, you'd realize that it's supposed to benefit from being airborne. Maybe pair it with something like the base jumper, perhaps. Heck, it even has reduced self-damage from rocket jumps to sweeten the deal. But then you take a look at the fine print, starting off with a 15% damage reduction, which means that those shots you take from the sky are going to be hit hard by damage falloff. And then you realize that not only is the weapon's blast radius reduced by 10% normally, but when you're up in the air, it gets even smaller, and a reduction of 28% is put on each rocket. This means that first off, you gotta hit directs, because of the small blast radius and the reduced damage, which brings up your second concern, which is that you can't be too far away from your target even though the weapon encourages you to be airborne. It doesn't matter how many rockets you have loaded in the chamber if each one is gonna do 28 damage tops. I mean, I've had crits with this weapon that fail to kill injured players. Now, I have no concrete idea how this weapon could be changed, or if it even needs a change in the first place. But if I were to paint with broad strokes here, I really like the concept of the weapon, but the stats on it seem to actively discourage making those sick bombing runs, and maybe even something as slight as a reload speed buff to mitigate the downtime between jumps would solve the problem, but as it stands, this weapon is just weird to me. And the next weapon on my list is a bit of a hot topic. On release, it divided the community, and in proper Valve fashion, the changes to the weapon were a bit heavy-handed. If you couldn't guess, I'm talking about the Dragon's Fury. And while I may have loved this weapon on release, the honeymoon phase has ended, and I'm just seeing all the negatives now. On paper, the weapon seemed really cool. A kind of high skill, high reward primary weapon for the pyro that breaks up the monotony that the normal flamethrowers sort of boil down to. But on release, the weapon had some glaring issues, with the prime offender being a deceptively large hitbox. With the Blue Moon update, however, the hitbox size was fixed, except not really. Now the projectile seems to have the opposite problem, feeling too small and inconsistent, and speaking of inconsistent, let's just all sit back and appreciate this clip. I think it does a really good job of highlighting the big old glaring problem with the fireball. And that's only the start of the problems with this weapon, because its primary gimmick doesn't work half of the time. It creates this weird situation where sometimes, even after hitting that essential first shot, by the time you can fire off the follow-up shot, the target won't be on fire anymore. That's right. So the whole reward for hitting your shot is practically negated. On top of both of these things, this weapon's reduced air blast rate takes away the major utility from the pyro, neutering their matchups against classes like Soldier and Demo Man, just completely removing the matchup with any projectile class and denying the pyro the ability to deny Ubers and just control a zone. And like I've said, I love this weapon. It's such a cool design, but when you take a look at all of these things, it's so hard to justify using it over just the normal flamethrower, which is so much easier and better in so many situations. Two of these problems could be quite easily solved by taking a look at the hitbox of the flame and by dealing with the problems with the afterburn burning out before follow-up shots. With those two things fixed, the weapon becomes functional, but the air blast penalties are still incredibly harsh, seeing how it gimps the pyro, and I think that reducing the air blast penalty would do wonders to help this weapon, because it's not incredibly overpowered as it stands, I'm not saying completely removing it would be a good idea, but maybe reducing it so it's not as harsh as a 50% reduction in air blast rate. And now, our final weapon that I want to discuss would be the Scout's primary. That's primary function is largely redundant. Talking about the backscatter, it's obviously meant to be a flanking primary that does the job worse than the scattergun. Let me explain. The big drawing point of this weapon is those mini crits that you get from behind the enemy, but what are you giving up? You're trading off 2 active shells, meaning you're only going to have 4 shots, and the weapon is 20% less accurate. These 2 drawbacks come together to make this weapon pointless. Having less accuracy means that you're going to be forced to fight close range with this weapon, even if you aren't going for those behind the back mini crits. This means those normal mid-range engagements you could normally take with the scattergun are a no-go with this weapon, because you're not going to be able to hit those shots consistently. And the clip penalty means that you have to make each shot count. Now, this doesn't sound too bad until you remember that mini critting with this weapon is rarely better than just shooting someone with the scattergun from the same range. In fact, there's precisely one situation where this weapon is any way better than the scattergun, and that's the fact that you can potentially one-shot 125 health classes from behind, assuming that you hit all of your shots and you're basically pressing yourself up against them. Against any other target, it can give you a nice boost to that initial shot on unsuspecting targets, but if they don't die from that initial shot, you're just using a worse scattergun. Now, improving this weapon could be as simple as removing the accuracy penalty on it. This would make the backscatter useful outside of those fringe cases, and while you still get a nice opening shot bonus from behind, you still have to manage your shots much more efficiently. But it'd actually be useful outside of flanking, and those are just some weapons that I think could use some love. Now, I'm obviously no game designer, so these suggestions are just that, my suggestions. These weapons aren't the worst in the game, but they are some that could easily be brought up to par with their peers, and some weapons that I really want to be good. Each of them has a unique design, and they're trying to cater towards a specific playstyle, but they just don't quite meet the mark. I would love to hear what you have to think about these weapons, or perhaps a weapon you believe to be down in the ditch and in need of some TLC down below in the comments. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, have a nice day, and peace out.